very briefly the law on data subject access requests. So the law on this is contained primarily under the UK GDPR, and that's some retained EU law. Anything the EU regulations there, the General Data Protection Regulation. So that's been retained into our domestic law through the UK GDPR, and then also governed by the Data Protection Act 2018, which is a UK statute. So under the UK GDPR, this is what gives this right for an individual to make a data subject access request. And just to give you a definition of that, a data subject may make a subject access request and a controller is under a duty to comply. So here the employer would be the controller and the employee is the data subject. And again, this is the legal side of it, but the Information Commissioner's Office publishes a lot of great detailed guidance on how this works in practice for employers. So a lot of the information today is taken from the Information Commissioner's Office. And then just briefly, what is personal data? So in the UK GDPR, it's defined as any information relating to an identified or identifiable living individual. So that's the data subject.
Something or two?
No, it's not. I'll come back.
Sorry. Yep, that's the background noise away there. So in the context of employment, this would be any sort of name, but also any sort of ID numbers, so any employee reference numbers, any location data. And as well, this translates into things like payroll information, emails, email addresses, occupational health reports, any minutes from meetings that the data subject's been involved in. And as well, some personal data is actually in a special category, which is defined in law, which requires more protection. And when you're dealing with this kind of sensitive data, you'd have to do a data protection impact assessment, and that again is found on the Information Commissioner's site. So things that are classified as special category would be things like race, ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, trade union memberships. So you'll see that there. There's loads of it. So as you can see, this man's very stressed out, which is how I'm guessing most employers feel when they might get a request through. I can see, very stressed. So just some practical advice on how to deal with a request when it comes in at that point, and to guide you through the process from when you get the request in and right through to delivering the information. So obviously when you get a request, they're quite laborious and they'll be very time consuming, heavy on resources, and they're often linked if you've got like an ongoing dispute going on with an employee or any impending litigation. So they can make these data subject access requests to get documentation that they plan to use for their side of the case. So there's kind of 3 broad rules for you to follow when responding, and these come straight from the UK GDPR legislation. So the first kind of broad rule is they must facilitate the exercise of the subject access request. The request must be handled lawfully, fairly and transparently, and the information must be provided in a concise, transparent, intelligible and easily accessible form using clear and plain language. And this last one comes into play in the form you choose for delivering the information back to them. So once you get the request in, you have 1 month to respond to it. This can be extended. This would depend on the complexity of the request, which we'll get into. And obviously, if you have a number of these in at a time, there's only so much resources you have to physically respond. But you would have to inform the employee within a month of any delay, and as well reasons for that delay. And there is certain circumstances as well where the clock will stop, which I'll go on to on our next slide, I believe. So the initial assessment, this will be the first step when you get your request in. So once you get the request, you want to try and refine the process just for efficiency reasons. And you can do this by, as soon as you get the request in, acknowledge it with the employee. And we actually have a really good template letter which you can use when acknowledging a request. It covers all the aspects, which if anyone's interested in, you can email me after. and I'd be happy to pass that along. So as part of your initial assessment, you have to verify the identity of the individual requesting their personal data. Now, when doing this, there might actually not be any need to verify the identity. It is a matter of using your discretion. For example, if you've got an ongoing relationship with this employee and you know them, it might not always be appropriate to ask them to present identification to you, because it's perhaps a number you already have, you know their voice, so you don't actually have to verify their identity, and that also makes the process a bit quicker. But if it's not someone you deal with a lot, and you don't fit under that category and you need to get some identification, keep it simple would be my advice there. It has to be something proportionate that you're asking them for. So something like a utility bill that's got their name and address, or a copy of their driving licence. Identification process. Don't pause. Keep preparing for your search and thinking about the next step in the process in the background. The next step in your initial assessment is clarifying the request and having an open line of communication with the requester. So quite often you'll get one of these requests in and it just says, I want a copy of all the personal data that you have on your files belonging to me. So usually if you ask for some clarity on the request and narrow down the scope, if you make this clear to the employee that you're asking for this, they'll usually comply. If you make it clear that you're trying to give them really relevant and pertinent information to their request. So this could be things like asking, is there a specific time period that you would like us to conduct the search? So perhaps it's to do with a dismissal, so are they wanting in a specific date range? That can help narrow your search and therefore the work you need to put into it. And as well, asking if there's a particular category of data they're looking for. So maybe it's a dispute over pay and they're looking for pay information and anything related to that. So just trying to narrow down the request can help you with the resources of getting it back to them. And then thirdly, when you first get it in, as part of your initial assessment, you want to start preparing your search criteria and making a real execution plan for how you're going to respond to this. So this will be considering, what are you actually going to search for? How do you reference people in your organisation? This could be things like their full name, their initials. Do you use any employee ID numbers? So really thinking about all the different searches for that one person. And as well, where are you going to look? You would usually start in the main the main inbox, search multiple inboxes. As well, once you've kind of looked through your main inboxes, looking at things like backup drives and archived files to really expand your search. And as well, just like I said before, having a strategy of how you're going to carry out the request. So you might have hundreds of thousands solely using their name. This might include emails, which they're just the recipient of, but they're not actually the data subject of that email. So really thinking about what you're going to include when you get back to them. And again, a big one is the form of the response. So once you've got your information, how are you going to get everything you've found on your search back to the requester? So I think a really important point to note here is that the legal right under the UK GDPR is to receive a copy of the data, not copies of original documents themselves. So this means that you do actually have a bit of discretion with the format of your response. And again, how you decide to get that back to them will depend on the resources available to you, software that you have available, and the time you have to put into the request. So you just have to consider which of these methods that I'm about to explain to you will provide the information in the most clear and accessible way. So the first method I'm going to talk you to is the redaction method. I think this is what I've seen personally most commonly used. So this will be when you provide screenshots or scans of an original document, but redacting out the personal data of any other individuals who might be mentioned, or any information that is not personal data. So for doing this, obviously you need to have the appropriate tools, the appropriate software. This would be like the full paid version of Adobe. And I know some organisations actually have to outsource to have this redaction service carried out. As well, the level of redaction you want to go for. Obviously, there's no requirement in law to supply information that's not personal, but the organisation might be of the view that it's going to be cheaper resource-wise to leave some things in, just because the manpower it physically takes to go through a large volume of documents and redact everything out. So again, the level of redaction you go for just depends on your approach to how you're going to respond. So the next method is the extraction method, which is something that member companies have asked us about. Are we able to extract data and put it in another document? So this will be taking it from the original location and putting it on a clean separate document. This could be like a table or an Excel spreadsheet. So just to give you an example, say there's several emails and you had an Excel spreadsheet and you could make a table. You could then be putting in the date, the time, the contents of the email, the personal data in the email, and this provides a document to them which is really clear, concise and easily navigated, especially when you've got a large quantity of repetitive data, for example, pay information. So it really just depends personally for you in terms of what the request actually is and what it's asking, which method you're going to go for and which method you think is going to be time saving for you, but still get the information to them in a way that's really clear and accessible to comply with your obligations. As well, just want to touch on some exemptions. Another thing we get asked about is, do I need to disclose this? I've heard that it's exempt. So just to be clear, the specific set out exemptions are any correspondence that is you receiving legal advice or is under litigation privilege. That doesn't have to be included when responding to a data subject access request. As well, any references you have on file that contains our personal data, but it's a reference for the purposes of employment or to an educational establishment, that doesn't have to be included. As well, any personal data, but where there's kind of forecasting or planning for business activities. And just an example of what might come under that would be disclosing information on like an upcoming staff redundancy before it's been announced to your workforce. So that would fall under this exemption. And again, they don't have to disclose any records relating to any negotiations between the employer and employee, if by disclosing it would prejudice those. So as well, as I say, we get asked about this so frequently that I was actually able to pull together some frequently asked questions. So I thought I'll go through these frequently asked questions and then just give a kind of response to them. If you're dealing with a data subject access request, it's likely these are maybe things that you've thought about. Sorry, there's my throat going. So the first question that we get asked a lot is, what if the data discloses information that identifies another individual? So the Information Commissioner's guidance on this, but important to note, this isn't a legal obligation or a requirement, but they've said the ideal approach is that you would consent, you would ask for their consent for their personal data being disclosed. But obviously, while this is the ideal situation, it's not always possible or appropriate. So it really is just a balancing exercise between the individual making the request rights and then the third party whose data has been disclosed and their competing rights. What the most common approach is that the third party information will be redacted out, and this will be in the view to give the requester as much of what they're seeking from the request, but protect the data of that third party individual. The third one is, we've had this response in, it's going to cripple us resource wise. Do we need to actually respond to it? So the position on this is that if a request is manifestly unfounded or excessive, that they may decide not to respond. But when making this decision, they would have to give the reasons to the employee and advise that the employee can complain to the Information Commission or apply to the court. Making this decision would be really high risk. The ICO themselves look really closely at your reasons, and it's a really quite a high threshold to meet for a request to be determined manifestly unfounded or excessive. I would definitely say if you're thinking about not responding, to reach out first and get some advice. A more sensible approach may be to, as I said earlier, clarify the request, try and narrow that scope down, communicate with the requester, and respond to the extent that you find proportionate. But yeah, definitely, if this is something you're kind of dealing with, take advice first. And the third question is, the employee making the request is only copied into this email. Do I need to include? So I think I touched on this earlier. If they're not the data subject to the email, but simply on a recipient list, say this is just like a general employee information update that's went out, or a mass meeting invite, then that wouldn't really fall under the obligation to disclose the data. But again, it just depends on the approach you're taking to the search. You might find it easier just to send everything, or you might be going through it more fine tooth and taking things out. Just depends on your approach. And as I was saying earlier, on the really useful CPD I've been going on, there's a few tips just on communicating sensibly and safely within your workplace. A few of them really got me thinking. So general rule of thumb, if you wouldn't be comfortable with it being read out in a tribunal or court, don't put it in an email. The amount of times someone will make a data subject access request, and it will come through and something really embarrassing gets disclosed, and obviously it doesn't look the best if you're in a situation where you're participating in any sort of litigation. As well, just raising awareness in your team of data protection implications. If you've got any IT communications or data protection policies and training, if you really kind of make your workforce aware that this is possible, that things they are emailing can be disclosed, they're more likely to be more careful with what they're sending out. As well, if you're corresponding on email, a good rule of thumb is not to mix personal conversations relating to work matters. Genuinely, just because if you're sending anything over, your personal conversations, if you're not taking the approach of redacting everything out, that could be disclosed. And as well, just before you send anything, just generally thinking whether or not this personal data needs to be disclosed. Does it need to go in there? And this last one was something that I'd never considered, and really got me thinking. If in your organisation you have a practice of using personal email addresses and social media platforms in a work capacity, so if it's quite like a custom and practice in your organisation that you're using your Hotmails and Outlooks, maybe platforms like LinkedIn, and you're disclosing someone's personal data, the ICO have actually published guidance that this can fall under the scope of a request. So I think that's one to be really careful with as well. And again, we'll send these slides out after the breakfast briefing. And there's just some links. As I say, the ICO are actually really good at giving step by step. So this step by step guide, the second one, kind of follows what I've been saying, but there is obviously a lot more to it. It's a huge topic. So hopefully this has given you a good outline of dealing with data subject access requests. And these are some resources that if you have one and you're dealing with it, I would definitely recommend reading. So that's us for today. Hopefully you all found that interesting and maybe learned something new. If anyone's got any questions, feel free to ask me and I'll try my best. If you've got any at all that come up once you've had a think about it, feel free just to email me, guys, and I'll get back to you. And again, if anyone wants the letter that I mentioned earlier on, when initially responding, let me know and I can send that across. But if anyone's got any questions, then I'll pop off. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Amie.
No worries. Is that you, Fiona?
No, it's Victoria.
It's Victoria, so it is. Thank you.
Thanks.
Great, see you later.
Thank you very much,
Bye.
Amie. It was great. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.